There's a kind of silence that doesn't soothe, it suffocates. It lives in the back of every classroom, behind the decorated bulletin boards, between the ticking of clocks and the ring of the next bell. A silence that says, don't speak unless spoken to. Don't stand out. Don't question too much. From the very beginning, long before you could articulate what you felt, you were trained not in curiosity, but in compliance. You thought you were learning math, grammar, geography. But what you were really learning was how to obey, how to wait, how to pass. Think back to that room for walls, a desk, a board. It looked harmless, but it wasn't neutral. It was designed to observe you, classify you, shape you. Foucault didn't describe schools as spaces of enlightenment. He called them soft prisons, places where you are watched, measured, and slowly taught to internalize the rules until you no longer need to be punished because you begin to punish yourself. Every wrong answer, every forgotten assignment, every red mark was more than just feedback. It was a seed of self-doubt, a quiet message that said, you are only safe if you perform, only valuable if you conform. Ivan Illich saw it too. The classroom wasn't about learning, it was about rehearsal. A stage for early submission. A training ground for adults who would someday sit in cubicles, attend meetings, meet deadlines not because they believed in what they were doing, but because once, long ago, they were taught that approval matters more than authenticity, that it's better to be polite than to be passionate, that fitting in is survival. So you adapt, you shrink, you color within the lines. And what of Nietzsche? He whispers a different truth, one the system never wanted you to hear. You are not born to memorize. You are born to create. But creation is dangerous in institutions built to preserve order. The child who asks why too often becomes the teenager who resists the script. And the system cannot afford that. So it decorates obedience with rewards. Gold stars, honor rolls, graduation caps, little symbols that whisper, you're doing great, even if, deep inside, something feels wrong. They told you to be yourself, but only within the boundaries of the curriculum. They encouraged you to dream big, but only if your dream fit a job description. Somewhere along the way, you stopped wondering what you truly wanted and started aiming for what they said you should want. Prestige, security, respect. But none of it ever really silenced that quiet ache, did it? That ache, it's old. It began the moment you were ranked, compared, sized up by numbers and judged by standards you never chose. And now, years later, many carry a wound they can't quite name. A haunting shame that says, I'm not enough. I never was. It's not your fault. You didn't fail. You were conditioned. This isn't just about school. It's about the architecture of control that began before you even had a sense of self. A system so subtle, so polished, that it made you believe you were the problem, not the design. This isn't about blame. It's about awareness. Because until you see how deep the programming runs, you can't reclaim the parts of you that were buried to survive it. So take a breath. Look back, not with guilt, but with clarity. Because the moment you name the lie, you begin to unlearn it. And in that unlearning, something powerful returns, the capacity to think freely, to feel deeply, to live on your own terms. The system taught you to memorize the map. This is your invitation to find the compass. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't come from others, it comes from the foundation you were taught to trust. The betrayal of freedom that begins with a pledge, a schedule, and a permission slip. You're told you're free, but only within institutional hours. You're told to speak your mind, but only when called upon. Even the illusion of rebellion is accounted for choreographed resistance, confined in detention slips and disciplinary warnings. The message was always clear: color outside the lines, and you'll be corrected. It wasn't rebellion. It was a test of how well you could return to form. The first lesson wasn't math or reading. It was fear. Fear of mistakes. Fear of standing alone. Fear of disapproval. You learned that getting things wrong wasn't just an academic issue, it was emotional exile. A subtle rejection that trained your nervous system to associate risk with shame. So you started raising your hand less. You stopped drawing outside the margins. You waited for cues. You learned to suppress the impulse, the instinct, the wild part of you that didn't fit the mold. Then came the grades, symbols of value assigned to your being. Letters and numbers that didn't just measure your knowledge, but your worth. Over time, you didn't need teachers to watch you anymore. You began to monitor yourself. You felt it, that internal voice questioning if you were smart enough, good enough, fast enough. The system's eyes became your own. And the tragedy? You thought this was growth. You thought self-surveillance was maturity. And when you became an adult, that inner surveillance didn't disappear. It evolved. The red pen became your boss's feedback. The gold star became a like on social media. The report card turned into your RSUM. You kept chasing the next validation, the next approval, hoping it would finally feel like enough. But it never did. Because the game was never designed to make you feel whole, only to keep you running. This is the archetype of the forgotten child, the one who was never taught to become, only to behave. You weren't asked what lit your soul on fire. You were taught to sit still, to follow rules, to pass tests. They didn't prepare you for a life of purpose. They prepared you for a life of performance. And now, perhaps without even realizing it, you've spent years trying to remember who you were before you were taught to forget. But the pain you carry, that ache, that numbness, that quiet grief, it's not a flaw. It's a signal. A sign that somewhere deep down, the real you remembers. Remembers a time when curiosity was sacred, when play was profound, when being different wasn't dangerous. That version of you still exists, buried beneath layers of conditioning, waiting, watching, hoping you'll come back. And maybe now, you will. It didn't feel like a prison. There were no bars, no shackles, just a desk, a teacher, a bell, and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. But something was watching. Not someone, something. A gaze without eyes. A pressure without touch. You felt it every time you hesitated before asking a question. Every time you looked at the clock and wondered why time moved so slowly. Every time you held your breath, afraid of being wrong, of being seen, of being too much. Michel Foucault called it the panopticon, a structure of power where surveillance becomes internalized, where you are always being observed, or at least you think you are, and that thought alone is enough to control you. You don't need a warden when you've learned to watch yourself. And in school, that lesson begins early. The teacher's gaze is enough. The seating chart is enough. The grading system is enough. You are not beaten into submission, you are trained into efficiency. This is the making of the good worker, the body that sits still, the voice that waits for permission, the mind that conforms, not questions. The reward isn't freedom, it's predictability. The more you adapt, the more you're praised. The better you perform, the more invisible your suffering becomes. And beneath that polished obedience, something quietly breaks. The imagination dulls. The instinct withers. The soul begins to disappear. Ren Girard wrote of mimetic desire how we learn what to want by watching others. School is the first arena for this invisible war. You want what they want because not wanting it makes you dangerous. You dress like them, talk like them, chase the same grades, the same approval. Not because it feels true, but because being different feels unsafe. And so the self fractures. Not dramatically, not loudly, but slowly, quietly. Like a river drying under artificial light. You grow into an adult who's hyper-competent, organized, punctual, and emotionally numb. You've mastered the game, but lost your spark. You know how to respond in meetings, how to meet deadlines, how to look successful. But ask yourself, when was the last time you felt real? Not functional, not productive, but truly alive. There's a metaphor here. A suit, clean and crisp, worn daily with pride. But inside, the soul shrinks, not from trauma, but from endless performance. You're not in chains, but you're not free either. You're just trained. And the hardest part, you don't even know who you are without the system that taught you to perform. The desk was never just a place to learn. It was the first cage, the first rehearsal. And now, long after the classroom has disappeared, the posture remains. You sit, you wait, you work, you comply, not because you're weak, but because you're shaped that way. And the truth is, the world doesn't need more efficient workers. It needs more liberated minds. Minds that have remembered what it means to move without fear, to speak without asking, to exist without shrinking. You weren't born to be good. You were born to be whole. You were told to try your best, to aim high, to be excellent. But no one ever asked what excellent really meant. Excellence in school wasn't about depth or originality. It was about accuracy, compliance, speed. It wasn't the thinker who was rewarded, it was the one who followed the formula. Got the right answer, checked the right box. You didn't have to understand, you just had to perform. So you adapted. You learned the rhythm of expectation. How to read what the teacher wanted. How to mimic intelligence even when you didn't feel it. You memorized, rehearsed, presented. And you were praised for it. Every grade, every honor, every nod of approval became a small hit of validation. Enough to keep you moving. Enough to keep you chasing. But something strange happened. The more you succeeded, the less you felt. The more you won, the more hollow it became. This is the tyranny of performance when life becomes a stage and your value becomes your output. When you're not asked who you are, but what you can do. When success isn't freedom, but another form of captivity dressed in applause. And slowly, the difference between pretending and being begins to blur. You learn to smile through burnout, to stay silent in meetings, to wear ambition like armor, because the fear of being irrelevant, of being unseen, is stronger than the desire to be authentic. You become a master of masks. But the soul begins to slip beneath the surface, untouched. Foucault understood this, that systems don't just demand obedience, they engineer identity. And when identity becomes tied to performance, failure feels like death. You stop taking risks. You avoid uncertainty. You cling to roles. Because if you fall, who are you without the applause? Nietzsche warned us the greatest danger isn't failure. It's obedient success. The kind that looks perfect on the outside, but is dead inside. The kind that wins the game and loses the self. Because in becoming what the system wanted, you slowly abandoned what you needed. You became efficient, but not expressive. Respected, but not real. You fit in so well, there was no space left for your edges. And perhaps the deepest tragedy is this: you didn't even know it was happening. You thought you were doing what was right, following the rules, making progress. But deep down, a voice kept whispering, "This isn't it." Not because you're ungrateful, not because you're lazy, but because part of you still remembers. The part that was never meant to be evaluated, only experienced. So you keep moving, achieving, climbing, but every step forward feels heavier. And you don't know why. Because no one told you that performance has a cost. That when you trade authenticity for approval, you don't just lose time, you lose yourself. And what you're left with is survival, masked as success. There's a deeper kind of control, one that doesn't come from fear, but from desire. Not the desire for freedom, but the desire for approval, for titles, for recognition. You chase the very thing that holds you captive because it's been dressed in gold. Degrees, promotions, status. They tell you it's success, but it's just a prettier form of submission. And the hardest part is that you asked for it. You worked for it. You wanted it. That's how powerful the system is. It convinces you to build your own prison, brick by brick, smile by smile. This is the paradox. The more you achieve, the deeper the chains. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because you are trained to believe that your worth must be earned. That being seen requires proving yourself. That rest is laziness, and ambition is virtue. You didn't question it, you inherited it. In school, you learned to crave praise, to feel worthy when validated, to attach your identity to external benchmarks. And now, long after graduation, those habits remain. You don't feel real unless someone else says you are. Ivan Illich saw through this illusion. He called it the pedagogy of dependence, a system designed not to liberate minds, but to mold them into service. Not to awaken agency, but to reinforce hierarchy. So you grow up believing that you must keep climbing, keep producing, keep sacrificing. And each time you do, the leash gets tighter but more beautiful. A raise, a title, a compliment. The golden leash, elegant, impressive, binding. It becomes almost impossible to distinguish ambition from obedience. You tell yourself it's for your future, for your family, for your dreams. But deep down, you sense something is off. That no matter how high you climb, there's no air up there. Just thinner oxygen. Just more to prove. More to protect. More of your soul to trade for applause. And it's not just professional. It's psychological. You start believing that rest must be earned. That joy must be productive. That your value is conditional. Even in silence, you feel guilty. Even in peace, you feel unproductive. Because the master is no longer outside of you, he's inside. Whispering every time you slow down, you're falling behind. This is not failure. This is training. And the cost is subtle, but devastating. Burnout becomes a badge of honor. Exhaustion becomes proof of commitment. And when the performance ends, when the stage is empty, you're left with a question no title can answer. Who am I when no one's watching? The truth is, real freedom begins where performance ends. But to get there, you have to see the cage for what it is, not made of iron, but of incentives. And you have to see the leash not as a tool of oppression, but as a reward you are taught to want. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. There was a time when everything fascinated you. A bug on the sidewalk, a cloud that looked like a face, the sound your voice made when you whispered into a fan. You didn't need a reason to wonder, you just did. Your mind was wild, unstructured, alive. But that kind of mind doesn't last long in a system built for control. The classroom replaced wonder with worksheets. Deadlines replaced daydreams. The more you adapted, the more you forgot how to ask your own questions. Curiosity didn't vanish overnight. It was smothered slowly beneath repetition and routine. You were taught to value answers over questions, to memorize instead of explore, to prove instead of play. And somewhere along the line, learning stopped being a path of discovery and became a strategy for survival. You learned to study not because you were hungry to understand, but because you were afraid to fail. This is the quiet death that no one speaks about, the death of inner aliveness. The emotional flatline of waking up each day and moving through the motions without ever touching the pulse of your own mind. Adults often say they feel numb, disconnected, empty, but they rarely trace it back to the early loss of mental freedom, to the years of silencing their instinct to wonder, to question, to feel. And what was left in place of that wonder? Exhaustion, anxiety, the constant hum of mental pressure. You don't even know what your own thoughts sound like anymore because they've been replaced by scripts, expectations, noise, and the most tragic part, you think that's normal. You think that's just adulthood, but it's not. It's the residue of a system that didn't just educate it, anesthetized. Jung called it the repression of the inner child. The imaginative, chaotic, soulful part of you that once danced in mud puddles and asked impossible questions. That part was buried beneath shoulds. Be quiet, be good, be reasonable, be realistic. And now, decades later, your mind still echoes those commands, even in solitude. It's not your fault. The garden of your mind was paved over, efficient, clean, lifeless. But deep beneath the concrete, the roots are still there, waiting, remembering, longing for a crack in the surface where light can return. And maybe, just maybe, the ache you feel isn't brokenness. Maybe it's memory, the memory of a mind that once belonged to you, before it was trained, before it was timed, before it was tamed. Not every tragedy screams. Some are quiet. They wear suits, meet deadlines, smile in photos. They're respected, admired, envied. But beneath the surface, something is missing. A silence that isn't peace. A stillness that isn't rest. It's the silence of someone who did everything right and still feels lost. Because no one told you that adaptation has a price. That becoming what the world asked of you often means abandoning what you asked of yourself. They praised you for how well you fit in, how responsible you were, how driven. But no one paused to ask, at what cost? Somewhere along the way, the applause became louder than your own voice. And so you adjusted. You became fluent in the language of expectations. You learned when to speak, when to smile, when to stay silent. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you stopped checking in with your own truth. You became efficient, polished, useful. But were you ever really whole? Foucault warned us systems don't just manage bodies. They sculpt minds. They reward predictability and discipline, not depth. And if you excel in such a system, the danger isn't just burnout. It's self-erasure. The parts of you that didn't fit the mold, the artist, the dreamer, the rebel were set aside, one by one, until all that remained was what the world could use. You succeeded, yes. But the question Nietzsche asked still lingers. You became useful, but did you become yourself? Sometimes the soul protests, not with words, but with symptoms. Restlessness, numbness, apathy, rage with no target, sadness with no story. These aren't signs of weakness, they're the shadow's voice. The part of you that was never welcomed at the table. The part that was too loud, too strange, too honest to be accepted in a world obsessed with polish. So it waits, hidden beneath the smile, behind the arsum, inside the perfectly curated life. And when the system finally exhausts you, when you realize that the ladder you climbed leads nowhere meaningful, the shadow speaks. It doesn't ask for answers. It asks for truth, for space, for you. This is the moment of awakening, when the cost of conformity becomes undeniable, when the old roles no longer fit, when success tastes like sand, and something ancient inside of you stirs, not because you've failed, but because you've finally stopped lying to yourself. There is an archetype for this moment, not the dropout, not the rebel, the deserter, the one who walks away not out of laziness, but out of lucidity, out of hunger, out of remembering, the one who chooses to leave a system that never made space for his soul and begins to walk toward a life that does. And it's not easy. It's not romantic, but it's real. Because what you lose when you're in the wrong game isn't just time. It's presence. It's clarity. It's yourself. And reclaiming that is the beginning of something sacred. Not all prisons have walls. Some are built from routines, from habits, from unspoken rules written in the margins of childhood notebooks. And the most enduring cages are the ones we forget we're inside. By the time you notice the bars, you've already memorized the dance. Wake up, work, achieve, repeat, until there's no one left behind your achievements. Just echoes of a self that never got the chance to breathe. Michel Foucault once said that true freedom isn't about escaping institutions. It's about recognizing the codes that operate within you. The ones that tell you to stay quiet when you want to scream, to be grateful when you feel hollow, to smile when you're drowning. These codes aren't obvious. They hide in politeness, in schedules, in dreams you didn't even choose. Ivan Illich dared to imagine something radical, a form of education that doesn't train obedience but awakens consciousness. Not a school that creates employees, but a space that calls forth the individual. Not a teacher that evaluates, but one who evokes. His vision wasn't an improvement of the system. It was a break from it, a fire lit in the name of agency, of aliveness, of truth. Theodor Adorno, sharp as ever, didn't just critique the system. He named the real danger the internalization of the cage. Not just being trapped, but learning to love your confinement, craving the very structures that hollow you out, building your identity on roles that were never yours to begin with, until the only thing scarier than the system is the thought of who you'd be without it. And maybe that's the final wound. The quiet ache that doesn't come from failure, but from never having tried to live outside the script. Not because you weren't brave, but because you were trained not to question the story. You were taught that maps matter more than compasses. That success means staying on the road, not forging your own. But maps can lie. They are drawn by others, shaped by consensus, biased by history. They show you where to go, not why you're going. A compass, though. A compass doesn't care about roads. It doesn't care about what others are doing. It only tells you one thing: what direction feels true. And sometimes that's enough. You are not born to be measured, or managed, or molded into efficiency. You are born to be vast, complicated, alive. And the time has come not to ask for the system's approval, but to step away from its applause, to burn the syllabus, to unlearn the obedience, to reclaim the part of you that never needed permission. You are not lost. You are unfinished. You are not broken. You are buried. So let the fire begin, not out of rage, but out of remembrance. Burn the map, reclaim the compass, and walk toward the place within you that was never meant to be graded, only lived.